When we have the privilege to travel, we find out not just that the places are different, but that the way people see the world is different. It can be trivial, as discovering that Kiwis talk about morning tea and afternoon coffee, the exact opposite of the way we do things properly in this country. It can be startling, as seeing in Uganda lots of adverts promising to help Ugandan women gain hips and bums. All the ways in which Western women feel pressurized to be smaller, African women feel pressurized to be bigger. That made me realize just how far from home I was. It can be jarring, as when on a team in southern Sudan, our leader said that we would fetch our own water. We felt it was demeaning that the young women of the village were having to do it for us. We thought it was unfair. Only later did we realize that they had felt honored to be given the task and then humiliated by us refusing to allow them to serve us in that way. Even when it comes to visiting churches in other countries, the way things are seen can be really different. I had the privilege to visit a church in Chicago where I was startled when we arrived that their car park was so vast it was divided into sections. Each had a massive letter at the top of a long pole, and we had just apparently parked in section Q. I visited another church in California where the prayer meeting began an hour before the service started. By the time the service actually started, there were almost 400 people in the prayer meeting, and the sense of contagious faith in the room was already extraordinary. I find it challenging even to remember that, when sometimes, as again we were this morning, we're rushing around so much between the services that we hardly have time to stop and pray even for a few minutes. In both of those places I was astonished. I found myself asking, how do we get from here to there? It's great to know it's possible, but what does getting from here to there look like? This passage in Acts 2 is another of these I'm parked in area Q moments for me, another of those 400 people in the prayer meeting moments for me. I'm simply brought up short by seeing the way things were for the first church. And I find myself asking, how do we get from here to there? Because presumably it is possible, or it would not have happened to the first church. Because presumably it is possible, or it would not have been recorded to inspire us. But there are times when it feels so far out of reach. So how do we get from here to there? First key to the journey is awe. Awe. Verse 43, everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. I just need to dig into that verse for a second. The RSV translates it like this, and fear came upon every soul, semicolon, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. Might seem a small point, but I think that semicolon really matters. The NIV translation suggests that the awe was a consequence of the wonders and signs being done. But the RSV translation, a more literal translation, suggests rather that the wonders and signs were a consequence of the awe. Now, I might be pushing it too far to say that the awe was their cause, but it's clearly mentioned first. It seems that the awe was their precondition, their awe-filled culture, their reverence for God's presence, their awe-strict conviction that the Holy Spirit was in their midst. That culture of awe lays the foundation for awesome deeds. It's daft to look at a car park like the one in Chicago and say, the way for us to become a church like that one is to build an enormous car park somewhere. It's simplistic to say that having an hour-long prayer meeting is the way for us to have such passion in prayer for our services. What matters is not the practices, it's the culture that flows into those practices. We don't have to copy the practices. We need to grow in the culture that gave them birth. So it's about the heart. It's about the soul of those church cultures. And it's the same when we look at the first church. We have to look at the soul of the first church if we want to know how to get from here to there. And the soul of the first church was filled with awe. Awe, we read in verse 43, came to each one of them. Literally, to each soul came awe. So what do we mean by awe? Well, the Greek word is actually simply fear. It's translated awe because it's an appropriate, reverent response that we call the fear of the Lord. That awe came to them because of what they had seen God do. Whether that was Jesus on the cross, whether it was Jesus being raised to new life, whether it was Jesus pouring out what they had seen and heard just at Pentecost. The only right response was fear, was awe. Awe that God was real. Awe that God was real, present, and available. Awe that God was real, present, and able. Or that God was rewriting the story of the world and what was more, including them in it. Or was the only right possible response. Wow. But not an excited response like on children's TV. It's wow. A wow that makes you want to kneel. A wow that makes you want to lie flat in surrender. A wow that is awed and overwhelmed at what God has done, and what that means for me, for us, for the world, and what God has done, and at what God will do. To fear the Lord is the only right response. To treat him with the reverence, the honor that he deserves. I wonder if you remember in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the second book in the Narnia series, the Pevensey children asking Mr. Beaver whether Aslan was safe. Aslan is a lion. Was he safe? Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. God is not safe. He's utterly good, but he isn't safe. We're in his hands. He is not in ours. We're privileged to be called his children. We are privileged to know him, privileged to have his very holy self, presence come and dwell with us, come and fill us. And when we react to his presence with awe, then it seems that God's power seems to flow more easily, flow more powerfully. It's not the cause, but maybe we need to see it as the precondition. That without awe that God, what God has done, without awe that God might do, will do, without awe, I think, no wonders. Second key to the heart of the church, the first church, is togetherness. Togetherness. Verse 41 and verse 42 tell us they're a single sentence in the original Greek, although they're divided up in our Bibles. They tell us that 3,000 were added to their number and that they then devoted themselves to four things, we're told. To the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, literally, to the breaking of bread, and again, literally, to the prayers. So one of the things to which the first church devoted themselves was a word, koinonia, which means fellowship. Koinonia talks about sharing together. About the first church recognizing that their sharing together in Jesus was something to which they needed to be devoted. They knew that belonging to Jesus meant belonging to his family. It's a little bit like getting married. Wonder what your first reactions were to your in-laws. Honestly, wedding rehearsals can be fascinating sometimes. Sometimes all kinds of interesting dynamics play out in front of you. It used to just be the bride and groom and the father of the bride and the best man who came. I think my record is somewhere between 25 and 30 people at the wedding rehearsal. And most of the time, they're joyful occasions. Most of the time, they're joyful occasions. Just occasionally, you can cut the atmosphere with a knife. So when we're getting married, we know that we love our spouse. We're just a bit wide-eyed about all the other weird members of the family and all the unresolved conflicts that build up at Christmas. Sometimes we know we want our spouse, but if we had a choice, frankly, we could take or leave the rest of the family. Truthfully, belonging to Jesus is like that. It means also accepting all the other members of the family. All the members of his family, as weird and as difficult, as broken and as cantankerous as we sometimes are. Belonging to Christ and not belonging to his body isn't a choice the New Testament thinks is possible. To choose the one and not the other would have been seen as incoherent as wanting raspberry jam that doesn't include raspberries, or wanting to play a game of competitive tennis on your own. Belonging to Christ and not belonging to his body would have seemed to them like trying to jump off your own shadow, as something that simply cannot be done, as something that is simply nonsense. Now I know today that many think that they can do that. People today often want to choose Jesus and not the church, or want to choose a particular church that suits them. One where the music is better, or the coffee is properly roasted, the sermons are shorter, and everything is just as they want it. Yes, we know Jesus came to save us one by one, but surely we cannot have the family? But he also came to include us in the family. Saying yes to Jesus and no to the family is in all kinds of ways really saying no to Jesus. Really saying that Jesus is wrong to love his church. So we see a clear emphasis in Acts on the togetherness of the first church. Acts 1:14 shows us that they all joined together constantly in prayer, both sexes and across the generations, in a radical way. Acts 2:1 shows us that they were all together in one place when the Spirit came. Following that means that it fell on all 120 of the believers. Again, men and women, apostles, not apostles, all generations. Verse 46 showed that they continued to meet in the temple courts, where a literal translation would be that they were with one mind in the temple, and also shared fellowship together in their homes, or coffee shop to coffee shop, as we might say today. The second key to the heart of the first church is togetherness. Honestly, Open House is one of the few places that our different generations and styles often meet. Wednesday morning is particularly lovely when we have a liturgical communion happening here. We have a mum and Todd's Bible study happening over there, and then everyone gathers together after those are finished. It's the most mixed I think we ever are. Partly our togetherness is challenged because we have 4 congregations across a Sunday. Partly our togetherness is challenged because those 4 congregations reflect different priorities, different styles, and to an extent different generations. And yes, different points of view held sometimes in tension. So togetherness is a challenge for us, one I'm sure we could do more to address. But a key to us growing in our togetherness is being able to disagree without judging and without criticizing. Criticizing how others prefer to worship, criticizing people of different generations, criticizing how others do things or want to do things. If we were less grumpy with one another, if we were less grumpy about one another, togetherness would be much less of a challenge for us. Third key to the heart of the first church, they were devoted. They were devoted. I don't know if you've realized that this year Ash Wednesday and Valentine's Day fall on the same day. So pick your celebration carefully. They are, let's face it, very different moods. Your love might not be chuffed if you come home with ash rather than flowers. And if you come to the Ash Wednesday communion with pink champagne, that might not be completely appropriate. The word devoted might sound it's more Valentine's Day than Ash Wednesday. But the word devoted here doesn't have emotional overtones. It's not an emotional state or a mood. It's a determination to shape your life in a certain way. The same word translated devoted, which, forgive me, is pros kataruntes, is used a number of times in these first chapters of Acts. Pros is a prefix which just means towards. Kataruntes means to be strong, to be steadfast. So devoted means to be strong towards something. Literal translation would be continuing steadfastly in something. So it's used in Acts 1:14 again to describe their commitment to praying together. This is seen as key to the culture, to the heart of the first church. It's used in verse 46 of today's passage to describe their commitment to being in the temple together. And it's a present participle. It's continuing steadfastly. It is something that they didn't do once. It's something they continued to do. It is something that they shaped their lives around. Again, in passing, where our passage has believers in verse 44, it's a participle, it's not a noun. Why does that matter? Simply because it literally means the believing ones. It is those with active faith. Those who are believing that God is in their midst, believing that God is on the move and that they are part of his purpose. Faith is an active movement into trust, not a passive acceptance of truth. It is something we step into and continue to step into. The 3,000 who responded to the message were not the only ones who heard it. They were the ones who chose to follow. The ones who chose to step into it, chose not just to hear the truth, but to step faithfully into trust. We are to be the believing ones, those who have stepped into active trust, those who have determined to shape our lives around our faith, shape it strongly, steadfastly towards Jesus. That's why we often talk about wanting to become ever more and more fully a devoted community, a church of people who shape our lives as a community and as individuals around our faith, as did the first church here in verse 42. They shaped their lives daily in these ways, a word that occurs in both verse 46 and 47. This was the characteristic shape of their lives. It's that reality described here that we have tried to capture in our discipleship process. I hope you've heard we talk about encountering God, about growing together, and about seeking the kingdom, and seeing that as a process that continues like a spiral, hopefully deeper and deeper. Encountering God is to be devoted to the apostles' teaching and practice. It has to be and practice because it's faith as an active movement into trust. Encountering God is also to be devoted to the breaking of bread, which means through the sacraments, and devoted to the prayers, as it is literally, which means to the gathering of the community in worship. Growing together is to be devoted to the fellowship as well, of course, devoted to the apostles' teaching and practice together. And seeking the kingdom is the showing of goodwill to all the people, which might be a better translation of verse 47, that the favor is not towards the church, the favor is from the church towards the people around them. Plus the obviously missionary movements we will work on through later on in Acts as we continue this series. We want to be a church that is a devoted community, one committed to shape its faith in these ways. To become like that first church in heart and soul, like that first church which changed human history. So the heart and soul of that first church is what we long to pursue. We're not going to build a big car park. We're not going to set a time for how many people have to be, how long and how many people have to be in prayer meetings before services. We are pursuing the heart and soul of that first church. And that heart and soul were nourished by awe, by togetherness, and by devotion. So what does all this mean for us today? I think it challenges us first. How does our culture as a church work against togetherness, How does our culture work against togetherness? I think it was Will Reevil who, when he was student pastor, please be praying for our students. They're just finishing up their weekend away at the moment. He told me that some of our students had started doing what they called the Highfield Marathon. Apparently it was a badge of honour for our students to come to all 3 main services on a single Sunday. And when we also had an 8 o'clock, it was all 4. I think maybe we should have a badge made. When they come to the end of the 6:30, they've been to all 3, we award them that Highfield Marathon badge. It was a bit daft on one level, particularly if they ended up hearing the same sermon 3 times over and over again. Honestly, when I'm preaching at 6:30, I preach the same service twice. Even I'm slightly sick of it. But it did give them a sense of the whole. A sense of the whole. And perhaps an appreciation for why different congregations choose to worship in different ways. Do some of us lack a sense of the whole? Someone, I think he was called Frank, I stayed with in Chorleywood years ago when I was on retreat, made a point of visiting Soul Survivor from time to time. Soul Survivor was planted out of St Andrews, Chorleywood, and Frank had been part of that process. So though Frank was in his 80s, though Soul Survivor wasn't the style of worship he liked, he admitted, I seem to remember, that he turned down his hearing aid when he went to Soul Survivor. He wanted to know how they were doing. He wanted to know how to pray for that congregation. He wanted, as he put it, to visit the family from time to time, know how they were doing and know how to pray. A way that we can build togetherness is visiting the family from time to time, even joining our students in just occasionally doing the Highfield Marathon. I did think, well, maybe we should have a Sunday where we encourage people to go to different congregations. That would completely defeat the object, though, wouldn't it? You'd all go to 9 o'clock, they'd all come at 10:30 and wonder what the difference was all about. Opening our hearts and minds to why others worship in the way that they do, rather than starting from the assumption that they're wrong. I fear we don't always hold our differences with grace, that sometimes we're quicker to complain and to criticize than to encourage. How can we work together towards togetherness? How can we find ways to honor one another despite our differences? Is it time to do your own Highfield Marathon? I think it challenged us, second, what is our faith environment like? What is our faith environment like? The language suggests that awe was caused by the presence and power of the Spirit in their midst, was caused by all that they had seen. They were expectant that God would come, expectant that God would move in power. The question wasn't whether, the question was how. Expectant that God would be glorified in their midst and through their prayers and service for others. And all of that flows from awe, a reverence for God's love, a reverence for God's purposes and plans, a reverence for living as He desires, a treasuring of His holiness in our midst. To what extent is our faith an active movement into trust? Where are we putting our faith on the line and with whom? How are we the believing ones at work? How are we the believing ones in our homes? How are we the believing ones with our friends? How awe-filled is our faith environment? I think it challenged us, third, how hungry are we? How hungry are we? Hunger is hard to quantify. Most of the West eats so much and so often that we have never really been hungry. We don't understand it. And I think there's a spiritual dimension to this, other than perhaps when you first came to faith. Then you knew that you needed God, then you were hungry for God. But few of us are hungry for God. Few of us have shaped our lives around hunger for God. The first church was hungry for God and hungry for His purposes in the world, They shaped their whole lives around it. Dare we ask God to give us the same hunger for his glory? Same hunger for his glory, even if that means turning our lives upside down. Even if it means completely changing the direction of our lives, as you've heard that Annie has done, as you've heard that Tim Taylor has done, as you've heard that Sue Coleman has done. Even if it means saying yes to the journey, frankly, without any sense of where it will take you. I fear we're not hungry for God. Yet I think we need to ask God to make us hungry. Because it feels that the church in our nation is on the back foot. It feels that many post-pandemic have lost confidence in the church, even lost confidence to an extent in their faith. And yet this picture of the heart and soul of the first church is given to us. It's given to us to encourage us, but it's also given to us to tell us that this is possible, that we can go there. Might be a long journey from here to there, but we can go there. It's given us a promise of what the church can be, of what the church maybe should be. A picture of a church that is filled with awe. A picture of a church that is filled with hunger. A picture of a church that is filled with togetherness, where people are stepping into active trust together. A picture of a church that is filled with devotion. Picture of a church where the presence and power of the Spirit abounded. So we have to believe God's word. We have to take him at his word, that God has that on his heart for the church again. It has to start somewhere in our nation. Please, God, it has to start somewhere. Please, God, may there be wildfires around the country as this hunger catches fire. But why not also here? Why not also now? Why not here and now with us? Are we willing to ask God for the hunger the church needs in this generation?